So, like I said, you'll need to sign up with a Twitter. You'll need to make yourself a user on Twitter to be able to use this code. But not only that, you'll have to take the extra step of setting yourself up on Twitter as a application, as a third-party application, and this is part of the OAuth piece that we'll be dealing with with the authentication in that first week. So once you sign up as a user on Twitter, create yourself an account on Twitter, you can go to dev.twitter.com and create an application. And I set up a screencast to walk you through this part. Beth, how are we going to get that URL to the users?
I gave the URL to Sarah, and she's going to put it into the chat rooms.
Okay, cool. Users. I said users. I say users for anybody. I call anybody a user. So that'll be helpful. Just go through that screencast however many times you need, and it will kind of show you what you need to do, even though the process is pretty simple, to set yourself up with and as a third-party application developer on Twitter. And that needs to be done before you run any of the code, because otherwise things pretty much won't start out right at all. So again, you'll need to set up a Twitter account. If you don't want to use Twitter, that's no big deal. Just keep yourself private. That's one of the one of the choices you have on Twitter, and no one will be able to see your witty 140-character tweets, but you will at least have what you need to run through this class. And once you've set up on Twitter, let's talk a little bit about what it means when I say safe authentication. So again, OAuth was kind of created so that users would be able to give permission to some third-party service or application or something to go basically act on their behalf at a server-based application, something like Twitter. And in fact, some people from Twitter were actually some of the creators of OAuth. So it's kind of like they're some of the first of the game with this newly developing standard. And I think you'll see a lot more of online services along the lines of Twitter. Like, for instance, Facebook is said that it's now going to be supporting OAuth 2 for signing in remotely. So if you do something somewhere that puts stuff on your Facebook account or somehow manipulates your Facebook account, you'll probably be signing in through OAuth in the future. So now that you have your Twitter account, you'll also need to set up your developer account, like I mentioned. And here is a long URL to the screencast that shows you what to do. I think the YouTube version was posted to chat just now. So there's a couple different links that you can go to, and I'll walk you through creating an application on Twitter there. So let's talk about OAuth a little bit. OAuth is basically a way to permit a third-party application to act on your behalf with resources on a website without knowing your credentials for that website. So credentials meaning your password. So you don't have to give your password out, and still you can give permission to some third-party application to act on your behalf on a service like Twitter. So where does OTweet, for instance, fit in? That is in in OAuth parlance, a consumer. The third-party application is called a consumer because it's consuming something from the server-based application on you, the user, or in OAuth parlance, the resource owner on your behalf. So the way it kind of works is the third-party app acting as an intermediary between you and the server as a user. Here's a kind of a simplified diagram that shows so the arrow going down is over time. These are kind of like conversations that are happening between these different actors over time. The user's on the left, the consumer's in the middle, and the server's on the right. So the first thing the user says in this conversation that OAuth lines out is to the consumer application or the third-party application like OTweet, hey, I'd like to load this resource from the server that happens to be protected. And at this point in the game, the user is unauthenticated. They haven't signed in. They haven't logged in at all. So the consumer application, this third-party application, says to the server, I need to get a request token from you, and I'm going to pass along these consumer tokens, which I go over in my screencast, how to get those consumer tokens. The consumer passes those to the servers, and the server says, yes, okay, I know who you are. You're a third-party application that's registered with our service, and I can see that you want to make a request on behalf of a user. So here are some temporary request tokens that you can use to make sure that I can figure out what user and what app I'll need to authenticate for. So the server passes back these request tokens, and the consumer keeps those around, and then says to the user, well, before you can do that, you need to sign in to this service. So it presents some way to sign in, either a native control or the web page like we'll be using, and then the user signs in, and they are now authenticated on the server. And the server will call back through some sort of mechanism to the consumer, and the consumer will say, okay, now good, the user is authenticated. I want to exchange the request token that I've already got for just this temporary authentication piece for something called an access token, and that's something that's more durable. It sticks around for the user. And the server says, okay, good, that request token is good. The user is authenticated. Here are the access tokens for that user. And the consumer can store those access tokens, and it basically uses that on every call to the server in place of where it would, for something like basic auth, use a username and password. So now the password's not flying around. The consumer never got the password from the user. It doesn't store the password or anything like that. So the user should feel safe that the consumer is now limited to doing whatever it said, whatever the server said give it permission to do, and it doesn't have the user's password. So now the process starts over again, except that the user is now in an authenticated state. So it says, hey consumer, I want to get this protected resource, and the consumer says sure, passes that request along to the server, and the server sends back the protected resource. Because the access tokens were sent along, it can verify that that user was authenticated and allowed or gave permission to the third-party application. So it's kind of a complicated dance that goes on all kind of behind the scenes, just so that the third-party application doesn't ever store the password. But apparently this is the way things are going on the web, so this will be kind of a nice exercise for you to get some experience with how the OAuth works. And to do all this, you need to get those consumer tokens. So OTweet is going to be looking for the consumer tokens to be stored locally. I've already set up my Twitter user to have a third-party account on Twitter, so I have some consumer tokens, but I don't want to share that with anybody else, and you as a third-party application developer wouldn't want to share your tokens with anyone else either. So each of you, to run the code, will need to sign up as a third-party application developer on Twitter and to get your own consumer tokens. And then the way that we're going to make it super simple for the user of our application to sign in is by acting as a browser type application. So when you sign up for Twitter, a Twitter third-party application developer, and create a new application, one of the things that I go over in my screencast is that you need to set up your application type as a browser type, and then you need to put in a callback URL of otweet.com authenticated. That's just a special key that when the user is authenticated, Twitter will redirect to that URL. And since we're acting as a browser type application, and we'll have a web view inside of our Twitter application that we build, we'll know that Twitter is redirecting to this particular URL, and we'll know that everything is now good. The user is authenticated, and we can go on to the next step of getting the access tokens. And all the user has to do is sign in and press OK or allow or something. I think that's the button name on the Twitter web view. So we can do all that. That'll be the interesting Android SDK part of that first week, where we intercept that redirection from Twitter to otweet.com authenticated, and then kick off the next part of the authentication process. So those are two important steps there. Make sure your browser application, and you put in that otweet.com authenticated callback URL. And then after all that is set up, you will have a consumer key and a consumer secret key, which I've blurred out here on mine. But you'll need those two pieces of information, and we'll put those into a properties file in our application there in the first week, and then you will be a consumer app on Twitter and be ready to act on behalf of a user. So pretty much the takeaway is that OAuth is around to eliminate the need for users to give passwords to third-party applications, but to allow them to act on their behalf. And we'll be going through that dance in a little more depth from an Android point of view next week. So, is there any questions about the OAuth part or what we went over today, or just this class in general?
We do have a few questions. Somebody asked, so the token and the secrets are for the apps. Is there a revocation list if an app goes away or the provider doesn't like it anymore?
So, yeah, you can. Once I didn't show this in any of these slides, but I think I show it next week. As a user, as just the normal Twitter user who wants to use a third-party application, you'll have a list of all the applications if you go to your Twitter account, I think to settings or something like that, and it shows all of the applications that you've given permission. And with Twitter, you can choose, when you give an application permission, you can choose either read-only or read and write, and you can see like what level of permission you've given to any third-party applications. And then you can at any time revoke that, and then that application's tokens will no longer be valid for that user. Then the access token won't be valid for that user, and they won't be able to the app won't work for that user anymore until they go back to sign in and authenticate again and get new access tokens.
Okay. And can we use OAuth for other services like Facebook?
Yeah, I'm not really sure of all the details, but OAuth, Facebook is going to start using OAuth 2 fairly soon.
Okay, so it sounds like this is definitely catching on with all the social sites.
Yeah.
Is OAuth
I can't think of any others right now.
To OpenID?
Okay, so yes, this OAuth is not OpenID. They're two separate things. OpenID, but they're you may see some convergence. So kind of like OpenID is a way to not have to. It's kind of the same thing in practice. Like I can sign in through some site with OpenID, and I don't have to create an account, or I don't have to manage a password, a username and password on that account at all, because it goes through whatever OpenID provider I use at some point during the authentication process, and then I basically say yes, I'm signing in through that OpenID provider, and then it redirects back to that other application, and then I don't actually have to maintain a username and password at all on the server application in that case. So it's slightly different, but it's kind of along the same lines. We may see some convergence down the line. I'm not sure. There's a little bit of churn in this area, and there's also a lot of development dance that has to go on with either one of those. So it'd be nice to kind of see some sort of convergence and overlap in what those types of protocols actually provide the user.
So is OAuth the only way to authenticate on Twitter? Is that the one they recommend? Are there other ways?
Yeah. Well, basic authentication still works, and it's not going to go away. It's just going to be deprecated on Twitter. So that's happening in June. I think I actually have it on this slide back here. Let me flip back to here. It says on June 30th, 2010, the Twitter API team will be shutting off basic authentication on the Twitter API. Okay, so I was wrong. It's not even going to work. So every Twitter application that you use where you sign in with a username and password is going to need to update to use OAuth instead, otherwise they won't work. And they've deprecated, I think, they're going to be deprecating it sometime around the beginning of June, so it's going to start to go out of favor, and they may send warnings, and they may, I don't know, they're going to be switching over fairly soon. One application that I use on the iPhone and iPad is called Twitterific, and they've already changed over to OAuth, and it was a pretty painless experience. It just like sort of signed me in. Um, I didn't have to worry about it at all, and it worked pretty well behind the scenes for me. So you'll see that thing starting to happen over time. So one interesting thing, though, from our perspective as developers of this little application, is that TwitPic for J, the Java library that I use later on to post pictures up to TwitPic, has not changed over to OAuth yet, and I'm not sure how that's gonna play out. There may even be a new version, and I may have to put up new code later in this class. But if the developer of that library doesn't get around to updating to OAuth during the class, but does sometime afterwards, I'll somehow we'll put something up on the forums or something like that. But if he doesn't get around to it at all, then I don't know, that part of the application may end up not working, which would be kind of a bummer. But at least from the Android point of view, you'd still learn how to use all the SDK features. But that's kind of the thing that happens with platforms like this. When they make choices, everybody's got to switch over, and there's a lot of work that has to be done all over the place. So luckily, we can start off with OAuth from the start and not have that problem.
Yep. So a couple people have asked to see the nice diagram you put together explaining how it works with the requests going back and forth.
Okay. Yeah. Hopefully that's easy enough to read. You can get a copy of these slides, though, and go over it, because it's definitely pretty in-depth.
Yeah, it is. And then while you're showing that, somebody had asked about XML graphics, and I'm not sure you were talking about creating graphics with XML. It was more that you use that XML file to specify what the graphic components are that go on the screen, right?
No, you can actually, with XML, there's sort of a drawing API that you can describe what you want to see in a specific XML dialect that Android gives you. Like I can say I want a gradient that goes from top to bottom and starts with this color and ends with this color, and it goes into a square that's this big, and so you can draw with XML.
Is it similar to SVG, or is it totally different?
I mean, it's similar in that it's like tagged, but it's not like a subset of SVG or anything like that. It's Android's completely own proprietary thing.
Okay, cool. Ruth and Sarah, do you have any more questions for Tony?
Yes. Somebody was asking, they're very concerned about the difference between 1.6 and 2.1 and whether they're going to need 2.1, 2.x test clients and above at some point for doing the work in this class and then beyond.
So the question is, they're wondering if they need to upgrade their SDK to 2.1?
They're wondering if they
for
need
this
to have
class?
all 2.1 test clients for this class, or if they can get by with lower test clients. I'm assuming that they have a 1.6.
So they may have run into this problem. I put the application up on the Android market for anybody to check out and kind of see what we're building, and it's only available for 2.1 because I did something with the thumbnail. So like when you take a picture with the camera, I create a thumbnail through an API that wasn't available before, I believe 2.1, maybe 2.0. So that was just like it's a lot easier. It's a lot less code. So I just did it that way. But so it's not available on 1.6. So that's maybe why they're asking this question. I could go through and change that code so that it's 1.6 compatible, and I think that's the only piece that's sort of using later SDK features, but it's just more code and kind of more noise. I mean, it's not really that hard to through Eclipse update your SDKs and have multiple SDKs ready to work with and create an emulator using 2.1. So I don't think that should be too much of a drawback for this class. To just set yourself up with the multiple SDKs. If you're worried about testing it on like devices, and you don't have a device that has 2.1, you won't be able to run this code unless you want to make the change there, or somehow convince me to make the change, I guess.
Is there some sort of device ID for each phone, so you can uniquely identify an Android phone. This is sort of a little bit off topic still, but they were just kind of curious about this. I'm assuming they're going to be doing something with that.
That's a good question. I don't know if there's a API to get a unique device ID. I know on the iPhone there is, and that's used during push notifications, but I don't know about Android. It's a good question. Could look into that. And maybe that's a good segue to talk about the forums.
We do have forums. It's at O'Reilly.com. If you go to forums.O'Reilly.com, there's a list of all our forums, and then I also posted the link in the chat room, which we can do again, directly to the Android forum, and it's a continuation of the forum that we used for the first part of the course. So you'll already see there's plenty of great content in there, questions and answers from the first part of the course. And if you have additional questions that didn't get answered today, or you want to ask Tony directly, feel free to post on the forums your questions. We'll get to them.
Yeah, and we'll just keep it going. Ask anything that you'd like about Android there.
So that was our overview class for this course. And like I said earlier, we will be posting this for free on O'Reilly.com. So if you missed anything, you can go back and look at it. If you need to get Android installed, there's plenty of instructions. I posted a screencast with a few bits of information about how to get the Android SDK installed in Eclipse. All you have to do is download Eclipse, download the Android SDK, and get that installed. And we did cover that in part 1. And use the forums again if you're struggling with that, and we can answer your questions there. And then come back next week, and we'll start getting you authenticated on Twitter. And I just wanted to say thank you again to our sponsor, AdMob, and look forward to seeing you all next time. So thanks very much. Round of applause for Tony.
Thanks, everyone, and I'll see you on the forums or next week.